The night air is thick with smoke, and the screams of the defenseless as longships glide silently onto the shore. These aren't mere travelers, they're predators, hardened by the unforgiving north and armed with axes that thirst for more than just timber. The Viking raid has begun not as a clash of armies, but as a whirlwind of violence designed to paralyze with terror. What followed wasn't just plunder, it was a calculated horror show where burning churches became beacons of fear and severed heads served as warnings to entire kingdoms. Behind the romanticized sagas lies a truth far darker. These were warriors who weaponized cruelty, turning coastal villages into graveyards and scribes' accounts into pages stained with dread. Over the next 25 revelations, we'll strip away the myths to expose the raw savagery of these raids where every torchlit face hiding in the shadows knew one certainty. The Northmen showed no mercy, and tomorrow might never come. The Vikings didn't just attack, they vanished from the mist itself. One moment, the shoreline was empty. The next, the horizon filled with the ominous silhouettes of longships cutting through the waves like blades. These weren't lumbering warships, but sleek, shallow-drafted beasts, gliding silently into rivers and estuaries where no enemy expected them. Monks kneeling in prayer looked up to see armored figures silhouetted against the dawn, already swinging axes before the alarm could even be raised. The raiders didn't just exploit weakness, they timed their strikes with chilling precision, hitting monasteries during holy days when the gates stood unguarded, and villages when harvests left them bloated with plunder. Fear worked faster than any weapon. By the time defenses scrambled into place, the Northmen were already vanishing back into the fog, leaving behind smoldering ruins and a single, unspoken message. No one was safe, and nowhere was beyond their reach. The genius of their brutality lay in its randomness, no pattern, no warning, just the ever-present dread that today might be the day the dragon ships returned. The battlefield falls unnaturally silent as a single figure steps forward, not with the disciplined march of a soldier, but with the twitching, restless energy of a caged animal. His bare pelt reeks of blood and sweat, his eyes glassy with something beyond rage. This is no ordinary warrior, this is a berserker. When the moment comes, he doesn't charge. He erupts, a hurricane of steel and teeth, biting down on his shield so hard the wood splinters. His axe moves faster than thought, limbs driven by a frenzy so terrifying that seasoned warriors falter mid-step. Some say it was mushrooms or potent brews that unlocked this state. Others whisper of Odin's curse, but the truth was written in the aftermath: bodies cleaved in half, faces frozen in shock, and a path carved through enemy lines like a scythe through wheat. What made the berserkers so devastating wasn't just their strength, it was the psychological warfare. Imagine standing shield to shield with your kin, only to see a man take a spear to the gut and keep swinging, laughing as blood soaks his furs. Armies didn't just lose fighters that day, they lost their nerve. The berserkers' myth spread faster than their raids, twisting reality into something darker. Chroniclers claimed they could blunt swords with their bare skin or walk through fire unharmed. Reality was simpler and somehow worse. These were men who'd trained their minds to embrace pain, turning their own bodies into weapons. And then there were the sounds, the howls that didn't sound human, the guttural chants that rose even over clashing steel. Witnesses swore the berserkers didn't speak during battle, only growled. It wasn't just about winning, it was about making sure survivors carried the tale for generations, until the mere rumor of a bare-cloaked warrior could send villages fleeing into the night. The Vikings didn't just wield fear, they distilled it into its purest form, and the berserkers were their masterpiece. The soft chanting of monks at prayer was often the last sound before hell spilled through the monastery gates. These holy men, who lived by the simple creed of peace, found themselves face to face with warriors who worshipped strength above all else. Monasteries weren't just targets of opportunity. They were strategic gold mines packed with silver chalices, jeweled reliquaries, and illuminated manuscripts that could fetch fortunes in foreign markets. But the real horror wasn't just the looting. Survivors told of altars drenched in blood, sacred texts fed to fires while still clutched in lifeless hands. Some monks were cut down mid-prayer, their bodies left draped over the very icons they'd sworn to protect. Others were dragged away in chains, holy vestments torn from their backs as they were paraded past smoldering ruins. The Vikings understood the power of desecration to destroy not just lives but the very symbols that gave those lives meaning. Villagers fared no better. Farmers returning from fields might find their homes already alight, their families herded like livestock onto waiting ships. Children were wrenched from cradles, the elderly left broken in the dirt. There was no honor in this slaughter, no grand battle, only the cold efficiency of hunters culling prey. What made these attacks so devastating wasn't just the scale of violence, but its indiscriminate nature. A blacksmith's strength meant nothing when faced with a dozen axes. A mother's pleas carried no weight, and perhaps most chilling of all, the Vikings left witnesses on purpose. A handful of broken survivors to spread the tale, ensuring the next target would be paralyzed by fear long before the first sail appeared. This wasn't mere cruelty, it was psychological warfare written in blood and smoke, a lesson repeated across generations. Resistance was futile, and mercy was a myth the Northmen had long since abandoned. Among the tangled seaweed and splintered shields along the shore, the first thing survivors often noticed was the smell: iron and salt, yes, but something sharper, charred wood and a sickly sweet decay. Then came the sight that froze the blood: rows of spear points crowned with what remained of the village elders, their faces locked in final screams, while the smoldering skeletons of fishing boats cast flickering shadows across the sand. The Vikings didn't just conquer, they staged their victories like gruesome theater. Consider the burning ships. A single longship set ablaze and pushed into a harbor wasn't merely destruction. It was a signal fire visible for miles, a declaration that nowhere was beyond their reach. The flames reflected in the eyes of those watching from nearby cliffs, searing not just timber but the psyche of an entire region. And then there were the heads not hidden, not buried, but displayed at crossroads and temple gates like some perverse harvest. These weren't battlefield trophies, they were billboards written in flesh, broadcasting a simple equation: defiance equaled desolation. What made this so effective was its precision. The raiders often spared a handful of witnesses, fishermen too broken to fight, children just old enough to understand, ensuring the stories spread faster than their ships could sail. Chroniclers wrote of towns surrendering without a single axe being raised, simply because someone arrived gasping about what had happened to their neighbors 3 valleys over. The Vikings weaponized rumor, letting terror do the scouting for their next raid, and perhaps most chilling, these displays required patience. It took time to methodically arrange those grisly markers, to stoke fires large enough to paint the clouds crimson. That wasn't the work of frenzied barbarians, it was the cold, deliberate craftsmanship of men who understood that true power didn't come from killing enemies, but from making the living too terrified to become enemies in the first place. The lesson echoed across generations. Some scars never fade, and the Northmen knew exactly where to cut. The shoreline reeked of misery, not just blood and smoke now, but the acrid stench of fear sweat from the huddled lines of captives roped together like livestock. The lucky ones lay dead where they'd fallen. The rest, they were about to learn the true price of survival in the Viking world. Slavery wasn't some side note to the raids, it was the engine that fueled them. Every captured man, woman, and child represented pure profit. Their fates sealed the moment rough hands wrenched them onto those waiting longships. The journey to the slave markets was its own kind of torment. Survivors describe being forced to march for days without water, their wrists rubbed raw by ropes while warriors prodded stragglers with spears. One account tells of a mother stumbling under her child's weight until a Northman casually split the boy's skull with an axe to lighten her load. The message was clear: resistance meant death, but compliance meant a fate some would later beg the gods to end. Thralls, as they were called, became the invisible scaffolding of Viking society. They tilled fields under the lash, hauled stones for chieftains' halls until their spines gave out, or, most cruelly, were forced to serve in the very households where their own families had been slaughtered. Archaeologists find their traces even now, mass graves filled with skeletons bearing the telltale marks of malnutrition and healed fractures. The bones of people worked like beasts until they simply broke. And the markets themselves, imagine the din of 1,000 voices haggling over human lives, children priced by the whiteness of their teeth, craftsmen valued for calloused hands that could still turn a profit. Dublin, Hedeby, Constantinople, these weren't just trading hubs but sprawling machines of suffering, where a captured Frankish blacksmith might end up reforging swords for the raiders who destroyed his village. The Vikings didn't just trade slaves, they weaponized despair, turning their victims' survival instinct into the very chain that bound them. Yet there's a dark irony here. Some thralls eventually earned freedom, even status, but only by becoming part of the system that had broken them. The Viking world offered no clean endings, only the slow erosion of hope, one backbreaking day at a time. For those dragged screaming onto those ships, the real horror wasn't the axe's kiss, it was the moment they realized death might have been the kinder fate. The air itself seemed to recoil when the Blood Eagle was spoken of, not just an execution, but a grotesque performance designed to break more than just bones. Reserved for those who'd earned the Vikings' deepest hatred, traitors, oath-breakers, kings who defied them too boldly, the ritual transformed a human body into a living altar of pain. The process was methodical. First, the victim was restrained face down, often atop a mound or raised platform where all could bear witness. With cold precision, the ribs were split from the spine, pried outward like the ribs of a ship under construction. Then came the final horror. The lungs, still inflating with panicked breaths, were carefully extracted and draped over the shoulders, a sickening mimicry of wings glistening in torchlight. Death didn't come quickly. Some accounts describe victims surviving long enough to watch their own blood pool beneath them in grotesque patterns. Scholars still debate whether the Blood Eagle was historical reality or a nightmare conjured by traumatized chroniclers. No archaeological evidence exists, only sagas and the feverish writings of Christian monks who may have exaggerated the details to paint the Northmen as literal demons. Yet the stories persist for good reason. Whether factual or not, the Blood Eagle wasn't just about killing, it was psychological warfare distilled to its most theatrical form. A warning etched in flesh: defy the Vikings and your suffering would become legend. What's chilling is how the ritual mirrored Viking values. The ribs pulled into wings evoked Odin's ravens, symbols of battlefield omens. The positioning face down, arms spread, mimicked the posture of sacrificed animals in Norse rites. Even in brutality, there was symbolism, a dark pageantry meant to assert dominance not just over the body, but over the very idea of resistance. And that's the grim truth behind the tales. The Blood Eagle, real or embellished, reveals something far more unsettling than Viking cruelty. It shows their mastery of fear as a tool. Every scream, every twitch of those dying wings was a message carried far beyond the execution grounds. By the time the sagas were written, the mere threat of this fate could make entire armies surrender without drawing a sword. That was the real power of the Blood Eagle. It didn't just kill enemies, it haunted the living. The fields didn't just burn, they screamed. Crops meant to feed families through winter crackled into ash under a sky blackened by smoke. Trees that had stood for generations were hacked down not for timber, but purely to deny shelter. Even the wells weren't spared. Animal carcasses rotting in the water ensured thirst would finish what the axes started. This wasn't mindless destruction. Every scorched acre, every poisoned spring was a calculated move in the Vikings' most chilling strategy. If they couldn't take it, no one could. Witness accounts from places like Winchester and Rowan describe the aftermath villages where not a single chicken remained alive, where fruit trees were methodically uprooted rather than merely felled. The goal wasn't just to weaken their enemies, but to erase their ability to recover. A starving population couldn't rally an army. A leader with no granaries to feed his people couldn't inspire loyalty. The Vikings didn't just want submission, they wanted desperation so deep it gnawed at the bones. And then there were the tools. Blacksmith forges smashed beyond repair, fishing nets cut to ribbons, even millstones cracked down the middle. These weren't acts of rage, they were surgical strikes against the very infrastructure of survival. A farmer might rebuild his house, but without a plowshare or seed grain, his family was already dead. The chronicler Ethelwerd wrote of refugees so hollow-eyed from hunger they chewed on bark, while Viking ships sailed away heavy with the one thing they'd left untouched: terror. The true genius of this brutality lay in its long game. Charred earth couldn't rebel. A poisoned well meant no future generation would drink from it. By the time survivors dared return, the land itself had become a collaborator, whispering to every would-be resister, "The Northmen don't just kill, they make sure you remember why you stopped fighting." What monarch could muster an army when his people were scraping moss from graves to fill their bellies? The Vikings didn't just win battles, they salted the future. The crackle of burning thatch was often the first warning, a sound that sent villagers running before the first war cry even echoed through the streets. Fire wasn't just a byproduct of Viking raids, it was a weapon wielded with terrifying precision. Flames didn't just destroy, they demoralized, turning thriving communities into smoldering ruins before survivors could even grasp what had happened. Imagine the scene: a coastal town at dusk, fishermen mending nets, children chasing chickens through the dirt until the night suddenly moves. Shadows detach from the tree line, carrying torches that dance like hellish fireflies. Within minutes, rooftops become funeral pyres, the heat so intense it warps iron tools left behind. The fire spreads faster than panic, leaping from house to house while raiders carve paths through the smoke, their silhouettes flickering like demons in the inferno's glow. But here's what made Viking fire tactics so devastating: they weren't random. Churches burned first, not just for their wealth, but because their towering spires became beacons of terror visible for miles. Grain stores went up in flames next, guaranteeing famine even for those who escaped the blades, and the timing impeccable. A dry summer's breeze could turn a single torch into an unstoppable wall of flame, while winter raids left survivors freezing amidst the ashes of their own shelters. The psychological impact cut deeper than the heat. Refugees stumbling into neighboring towns didn't just carry tales of violence, they brought the stench of smoke clinging to their clothes, the burns on their hands from futile attempts to salvage anything. Chroniclers wrote of kings receiving reports not of battles lost, but of landscapes erased, where only blackened timbers and the occasional half-melted crucifix marked places that once had names. And perhaps the cruelest twist, the Vikings often spared just enough to make the survivors watch. A single untouched barn on the outskirts, a handful of orphan children left to wander, living proof of what happened when defiance met the Northmen's fury. Fire wasn't merely destruction, it was a ledger, its embers recording the cost of resistance in scars that lasted generations. Where swords could be outrun, flames wrote their message in a language every soul understood: this land is ours now. Even the ashes agree. The laughter of children playing near the shoreline would often be the last joyful sound before the nightmare began. Viking raiders understood something brutal yet strategic. To truly break a people, you didn't just kill their warriors, you destroyed their future. Little ones who should have been chasing seagulls or braiding wildflowers found themselves running from men who saw them not as innocents but as leverage. Accounts from monasteries like Lindisfarne describe infants torn from their mothers' arms and swung headfirst into stone walls, their tiny bodies discarded like broken toys. Others were scooped up screaming valuable not for labor, but for the ransom their desperate families might pay. But there was a darker fate still. Children strong enough to walk but too weak to resist were marched back to the longships in chains. Some would drown before reaching foreign shores. Those who survived faced horrors beyond imagination. Boys forced to spar for their captors' entertainment, their wooden practice swords swapped for real steel once they proved just strong enough to swing them. The psychological impact was deliberate. A village that lost its elders could rebuild, but a community stripped of its children, that was a wound that never healed. Chronicles speak of mothers who walked into the sea rather than face empty cradles, of fathers who went mad searching coastal caves for faces they'd never see again. The Vikings didn't just exploit weakness, they weaponized grief, knowing a broken spirit fights far less fiercely than a broken body. And then there were the survivors, the stolen ones who lived long enough to forget their mother tongue, who grew tall under foreign skies. Some became thralls, their small hands calloused from grinding grain or scrubbing blood from armor. A rare few, through luck or cruelty, might be raised as Vikings themselves, taught to wield axes against people who looked like the parents they could barely remember. This was the true horror behind the raid's aftermath. It wasn't just the bodies left behind, it was the ghosts of potential, the futures snuffed out or twisted beyond recognition. When the Northmen sailed away, they didn't just take gold and grain. They took the very sound of a village heartbeat, the giggle of children that would never again echo through the burned-out halls. The golden cross above the altar swayed slightly as the monastery doors burst inward, not with the quiet reverence of worshippers, but with the thunder of axes splitting oak. To the monks huddled in prayer, this wasn't just an invasion, it was the unraveling of divine order itself. The Vikings didn't merely rob sacred sites, they turned sanctity into spectacle, grinding consecrated relics underfoot while chanting mock hymns in fractured Latin. Every shattered chalice, every defiled burial shroud, was a deliberate insult to the heavens their victims believed in. What made these violations so devastating wasn't just the loss of gold or art, it was the calculated assault on faith. Imagine a warrior prying jewels from a saint's casket with his teeth, or a laughing raider using a torn Bible page to light his torch. These weren't impulsive acts of greed, they were performances designed to break spirits. Chroniclers wrote of priests forced to watch as invaders baptized each other in stolen communion wine, or of sacred bones scattered like dice across blood-slick floors. The message was clear, the gods of the conquered held no power here, yet there's a grim irony in these attacks. The same Vikings who scorned Christian holiness carried amulets of Thor's hammer into battle, believing their own deities granted strength. This wasn't true atheism, it was a brutal declaration that only one pantheon deserved fear. By targeting churches first, they struck at the core of their enemy's identity, proving that no divine protection could shield the faithful from Northmen's fury. The psychological impact rippled far beyond the rubble. When word spread that even Lindisfarne's holy island, a place so revered birds wouldn't fly over it, had been violated, entire kingdoms questioned whether their god had abandoned them. Some villages surrendered without resistance, convinced their prayers had turned to ash with the monasteries. Others doubled their tithes, desperate to buy celestial favor before the longships returned. But perhaps the most chilling detail, many raiders took souvenirs, not just gold, but censers, vestments, even fragments of altars. These weren't mere trophies, they were props for retellings around winter fires, proof that no realm, earthly or divine, lay beyond their reach. The Vikings understood something primal. To conquer a people, you must first conquer their gods, and what better way than by turning sanctuaries into stages for sacrilege? The ropes bit deep into their wrists as the women stumbled onto foreign shores, their homeland screams still ringing in their ears. Viking raids didn't just plunder treasure, they harvested lives, and among the most vulnerable were the women torn from their villages. To the warriors, these captives weren't just spoils of war, they were tools to be used, broken, or traded without a second thought. Some faced immediate horror, dragged into tents or longships, subjected to violations their chroniclers could only hint at in hushed tones. Others were paraded before chieftains like livestock, inspected for traits that might fetch higher prices at market: youth, beauty, or the calloused hands of a skilled weaver. The sagas tell of thrall markets where mothers and daughters were separated with a trader's casual gesture, their pleas drowned out by the clatter of silver on scales. But captivity was only the beginning. A fortunate few might be forced into marriage, though fortunate was a cruel joke. These were unions forged not by consent but by the edge of a blade. Archaeological finds reveal graves of women buried with Nordic brooches but wearing fragments of foreign garments beneath, silent witnesses to lives violently rewritten. Others endured back-breaking labor hauling water, grinding grain until their fingers bled, or worse, serving as bed slaves to men who'd slaughtered their kin. Then there were those deemed expendable. When a Viking chieftain died, his thralls sometimes followed him into the afterlife, not as mourners but as sacrifices. The Rimbert Chronicle describes a young Frankish girl strangled with a silken cord and laid at her master's feet, an offering to gods she didn't worship. For every woman sold at market, another might vanish into the boglands, her bones preserved by the peat centuries later, mouth still frozen in a scream. Yet defiance flickered even here. Runestones across Scandinavia whisper of captive women who poisoned their masters' mead or slit their throats in the night. The most haunting tales are of those who chose the sea, leaping from cliffs with their children rather than let them be raised by raiders. These weren't passive victims, they were casualties of a system that saw their suffering as collateral damage in the pursuit of power. What makes their stories so chilling isn't just the brutality, it's the cold efficiency of it all. Viking law codes detailed punishments for harming another man's thrall. It damaged his property, but said nothing of the thrall's pain. These women weren't people in the sagas, they were shadows at the edges of glory tales, their voices silenced by the very histories that recorded their captivity. Their real legacy, a reminder that when we speak of Viking conquest, we're also speaking of countless unnamed souls who paid for it in blood and brokenness. The screams didn't always stop when the axes fell. Sometimes they lingered, deliberately stretched into hours, even days. For the Vikings, pain wasn't just a byproduct of war. It was a language, each cry a syllable in a brutal sermon preached to the living. A captured spy might find himself staked over an anthill, his skin blistering under the sun while raiders placed bets on how long he'd beg for death. A defiant chieftain could wake to find his tendons slit, left writhing in the dirt as his own men watched, learning the cost of resistance. What set Viking torture apart wasn't just its cruelty, it was the theatricality. Flaying, for instance, wasn't merely skinning alive. The process was slow, methodical, often starting at the extremities so the victim remained conscious as their body became a grotesque map of exposed muscle. Some accounts speak of salt rubbed into the wounds, not to sterilize but to prolong the agony. And then there was the drowning cage, a weighted iron prison lowered into a river just deep enough to flood the lungs in vicious cycles, a torment that could last until the tide turned. But here's the chilling truth: these horrors weren't hidden. Victims were displayed where their shrieks carried far, just at crossroads, outside city gates, or tied to driftwood where the tide would parade their broken forms. The goal wasn't secrecy, it was spectacle. A single mutilated survivor could demoralize an entire region, their mangled hands or seared eyes serving as a living billboard for Viking ruthlessness. The psychological calculus was flawless. Torture didn't just break individuals, it rewired communities. Parents taught children to lower their eyes when strangers passed, lest a glance be mistaken for defiance. Warriors hesitated before rallying allies, remembering the trader they'd found last spring, his lips stitched shut with his own entrails. Even the methods carried symbolism. Drowning invoked the Norse belief that those who died without honor sank to Hell's murky realm, while flayed skin echoed the fate of Loki's punishment in their myths. And perhaps most unsettling, the Vikings didn't reserve torture for enemies. Their own faced the same fate for cowardice or oath-breaking, proof that this wasn't mindless savagery but a system. Pain wasn't just a weapon, it was the glue of their social order, a reminder that even among the conquerors, there was always someone higher on the chain of suffering. The message rang clear across seas and generations. In the Viking world, mercy was the rarest currency of all. The flames that consumed monastery libraries didn't just burn parchment, they erased entire worlds of thought. Each crackling manuscript contained knowledge painstakingly copied by generations of monks. Star charts tracking celestial movements, medical treatises blending science and prayer, chronicles of kings whose names would now vanish like smoke. The Vikings saw no value in these treasures unless the pages could be peeled apart for their gold leaf or the bindings melted down. What they left behind wasn't just rubble, it was a void where history itself had been hollowed out. Consider the fate of the Codex Aureus, one of the most lavishly decorated gospels of its age. Raiders tore its jeweled cover away like wolves stripping meat from bone, leaving the illuminated pages to scatter in the mud. In that single act, artistry that had taken a lifetime to create became road dust. Other manuscripts met crueler fates, thrown into latrines, stuffed into boots for insulation, or fed to fires as kindling while warriors warmed their hands over the very words meant to outlast empires. The loss wasn't merely quantitative. Fragments survive of a 9th century herbal manual that described plants capable of curing fever, knowledge that might have saved thousands had it not been reduced to embers at Lindisfarne. Astronomical tables predicting comet cycles turned to ash, severing humanity's connection to past observations of the cosmos. Even mundane records, tax rolls, weather patterns, recipes vanished, leaving scholars today to piece together Dark Age Europe like a puzzle with half its pieces missing. But the most insidious destruction was selective. Viking traders prized practical knowledge, maps, shipbuilding techniques, metallurgy, and often spared those texts. What they burned were the intangibles of poetry, theology, musical notation. This wasn't accidental vandalism, it was cultural surgery, removing the soul of a civilization while keeping its useful organs intact. A Frankish monk lamented in a surviving letter that the Northmen left them, alive enough to serve but gutted of all that made us more than beasts. The echoes of this loss still haunt us. Imagine the works of Aristotle or Plato surviving only as charred scraps in an archaeologist's sieve. That's the magnitude of what disappeared in those raids, not just ink on vellum, but the collective memory of a continent. When we mourn the Library of Alexandria, we forget that the Viking Age saw countless smaller Alexandrias extinguished one torch flame at a time. Their greatest violence wasn't measured in bodies counted, but in ideas that never had the chance to breathe. The clash of steel might have defined Viking battles, but the real game changer was something far colder, silver gleaming in a chieftain's palm. These warriors weren't bound by oaths of nationhood or divine mandate, they answered to the weight of a purse. For the right price, a band of Northmen would turn their axes on yesterday's allies as casually as flipping a cloak inside out. This wasn't just warfare, it was commerce written in blood. Take the Siege of Paris in 885. The same Vikings who'd spent months starving the city suddenly lifted their blockade not because they'd been defeated, but because Emperor Charles the Fat offered them 700 pounds of silver to go raid somewhere else. The message was clear: Viking loyalty had an expiration date, and it was stamped on the bottom of a coin. Even their own sagas mocked the idea of fixed allegiances. One poem describes a warrior boasting he'd fight for the hand that feeds me today, knowing tomorrow might bring a richer patron. What made this so terrifying wasn't the betrayal itself, but its predictability. Kings who hired Viking bands as bodyguards often found themselves sleeping with one eye open, aware their protectors were taking notes on which gates were left unbarred, which vaults were lightly guarded. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells of a Mercian lord who paid a crew to defend his lands only for those same mercenaries to lead a rival army straight to his doorstep months later, their new contract tucked into their belts beside freshly sharpened knives. Yet there was a twisted genius to this system. Viking mercenaries became the ultimate free agents, playing factions against each other like pieces on a chessboard. In Constantinople, the Varangian Guard, an elite force of Norse sellswords, were prized precisely because they had no local ties. Their axes fell with equal ferocity on rebels or imperial rivals, so long as the emperor's gold kept flowing. To rely on such men was to dance on a blade's edge. A Frankish chronicler lamented that hiring Vikings was like trying to warm oneself by lighting their own house afire. The lesson echoed across battlefields and bargaining tables. In the Viking world, loyalty wasn't earned, it was leased, and when the payment stopped, so did the pretense of friendship. Their greatest weapon wasn't the axe or the flame, but the understanding that every alliance carried an unspoken addendum: until someone pays me more. The sacred grove reeked of iron and damp earth as the gathered warriors fell silent. At the center, a man stood bound to the great oak, not a criminal, not an enemy, but a chosen offering. His fate had been sealed the moment the chieftain drew the marked lot from the bag. This wasn't execution, it was communion. Viking rituals demanded more than animal sacrifices. They craved the ultimate price: human life. Captives taken in raids faced chilling fates beyond slavery. Some were hanged from trees as offerings to Odin, their bodies left to swing like macabre pendulums counting down to the next harvest. Others met the blot, a ceremonial stab wound just below the ribs, letting their lifeblood drain into ritual bowls to be splashed across idols and altars. The most dreaded fate, the drowning pit where bound victims were plunged into bog waters, their final bubbles rising as prayers to the gods. Archaeology confirms the horror. The Tollund man, preserved for millennia in Danish peat, still wears the noose that ended his life. His peaceful expression suggests sedation, perhaps a final mercy before the gods claimed him. Other sites reveal far more violent ends: fractured skulls beside ritual daggers, skeletons with throats slit in patterns matching descriptions of Odinic sacrifices. These weren't secret rites, they were spectacles. The entire community participated, from the chieftain conducting the ceremony to children tossing flower garlands onto the bodies. A grotesque festival where piety and power intertwined. But here's what unsettles modern scholars most: some victims went willingly. The sagas speak of old warriors volunteering for the hanging, eager to ride with Odin to Valhalla. Slave women sometimes embraced the sacrificial knife, believing it would reunite them with lost kin in the afterlife. This wasn't mere coercion, it was a belief system so potent it could turn terror into transcendence. Yet for every willing participant, countless others had no choice. Foreign captives, monks, farmers, even nobles found themselves thrust onto altars, their deaths staged as divine theater. When the Skald's chant rose and the blade fell, the message was clear. The gods favored the ruthless, and resistance was not just futile, it was sacrilege. The true genius of these sacrifices lay in their duality. To outsiders, they were atrocities. To the Vikings, they were acts of devotion so vital that skipping them might doom their crops, their raids, even their souls. Every drop spilled was both a negotiation with the divine and a warning to the living. In this world, you were either the sacrificer or the sacrificed. The whisper of a single word could send villages spiraling into panic Vikinger. Long before dragon-proud ships darkened the horizon, the terror had already arrived, carried on the lips of fleeing refugees and the scribbled warnings of monks. The Northmen didn't just wield fear, they manufactured it, refining their reputation into a psychological weapon sharper than any axe. Consider the sheer efficiency of this terror. A Frankish chronicle recounts how an entire coastal region abandoned their homes simply because fishermen spotted strange sails near the mouth of the Seine sails that turned out to be harmless traders. But in the shadow of past raids, no one dared wait for confirmation. Vikings rarely needed to strike twice in the same place. The memory of their first visit did the work for them. Kings faced an impossible choice: fight and risk seeing their fields salted and their heirs butchered, or pay the Danegeld, the infamous protection money that was really just extortion dressed in silk. The math was brutal but logical. Why lose an army and a fortune when you could keep your land intact by surrendering only silver? This wasn't weakness, it was survival calculus. England alone paid over 2 million silver pennies across decades, enough to bankrupt modern nations. The brilliance lay in the Vikings' restraint, sometimes leaving a single village unharmed but thoroughly watched spread more terror than burning it. Survivors from neighboring towns would spin tales of the raiders' eerie discipline, their cold selectivity. Were they scouts for a larger force, a warning? The uncertainty paralyzed entire regions, turning farmers into nervous sentries jumping at every snapped twig. And then there were the stories. Sagas deliberately exaggerated atrocities, knowing word would travel faster than their ships. By the time a trading caravan reached Paris, the tale of a minor skirmish might morph into a legend of an entire city swallowed by flames. The Vikings didn't correct these rumors, they cultivated them, letting their myth grow until the mere crunch of gravel underfoot could send families fleeing into the night. This economy of fear had a dark irony. The more people surrendered without resistance, the more the Vikings' reputation swelled, and the less they actually needed to fight. Their greatest conquests weren't won on battlefields, but in the hushed councils of rulers counting their coffers, deciding whether defiance was worth the cost of becoming another cautionary tale. In the end, the Northmen proved a haunting truth: sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one never drawn. The land itself bore scars long after the last longship vanished over the horizon. Viking raids didn't stop at slaughtering populations, they attacked the very earth that sustained them. Imagine riding through what was once a thriving valley, only to find blackened stumps where orchards stood, the streams clogged with debris from sabotaged mills, and the rich smell of turned soil replaced by the acrid stench of salt-scorched earth. This wasn't collateral damage, it was systematic erasure. Forests that had taken centuries to grow were set ablaze not just to deny cover to enemies, but to cripple future rebuilding. Without timber, survivors couldn't reconstruct homes or forge tools. Fields weren't merely trampled, they were deliberately poisoned. Salt, precious and expensive, was scattered like cursed snow across fertile plots, rendering the ground sterile for decades. A single raiding party could doom generations to starvation, their handiwork measured in withered crops and hollow-cheeked children. Waterways became weapons. Vikings dammed rivers to flood settlements, drowning entire villages under churning brown water. When they retreated, they left the dams intact, ensuring the wreckage festered in stagnant pools, breeding grounds for disease. Marshlands spread where crops once grew, transforming landscapes so thoroughly that later maps bore no trace of the communities that had thrived there. Perhaps most chilling was the precision of this destruction. Raiders bypassed certain tracts of land not from mercy, but to create isolated pockets of survivors who'd serve as living testimonies. These witnesses would wander ruined regions, telling neighbors of streams running black with ash or fruit trees that bloomed but never bore. The message was unmistakable. The Northmen didn't just take your present, they stole your descendants' future. Archaeologists still uncover traces of this ecological warfare. Pollen samples show abrupt shifts from crop grains to weeds, while layers of charcoal in soil cores mark where Viking fires ended centuries of agriculture. In some places, the earth never fully recovered. Modern farmers plow around patches of ground that remain barren, their poison lingering like a ghost. Yet there's a dark irony here. The same Vikings who ravaged foreign lands practiced careful stewardship at home. Norse laws protected forests and fisheries, punishing those who overharvested. This contradiction reveals the calculus behind their brutality. The environment wasn't sacred, it was strategic. To the Vikings, a conquered land wasn't a prize to cherish, but a rival to dismantle. Their true legacy wasn't just the bones they left behind, but the silence that followed the missing birdsong where woods once stood, the empty granaries where mice now nested in dust. They taught a grim lesson: it takes far less to destroy a civilization than to build one. The nightmares didn't stop when the longships disappeared. Survivors who had hidden in marshes or clung to rafters while their world burned below would flinch at the sound of a branch snapping. Was that the wind or the crunch of a raider's boot? Chroniclers describe grown men weeping at the sight of a distant sail, women who could no longer bear the smell of smoke without collapsing. The Vikings didn't just take lives and loot, they stole peace of mind, leaving wounds no bandage could cover. One monk's account tells of a peasant who refused to enter his own barn for years after finding his family slaughtered there, letting the harvest rot rather than face the ghosts. Entire villages developed superstitions, knocking on wood before speaking of the Northmen, hanging iron nails over doorways to repel their spirits. The trauma reshaped language itself. Old English manuscripts began using Weising not just for raiders but as a synonym for demon. The enemy hadn't just invaded shores, they'd infiltrated dreams. Children raised on whispered horror stories grew into adults who startled at seabirds' cries, mistaking them for war horns. Some cultures institutionalized the fear. Irish mass rocks hidden in forests for outdoor worship weren't just about piety, but the need to flee at a moment's notice. Even generations later, farmers plowing near ruined monasteries would cross themselves when turning up a charred piece of parchment, as if the ashes themselves carried a curse. What made this psychological warfare so insidious was its ripple effect. A single raid could twist the psyche of an entire region, altering trade routes, parenting practices, even architectural styles. Churches built after Viking invasions often lacked windows on their seaward sides, not for structural reasons, but because congregations couldn't bear the sight of the horizon. The sagas boast of battles won, but the real victory lay in something far quieter. The way a mother's hand shook decades later while braiding her daughter's hair, her ears still straining for the rhythm of oars in the night. And then there were the silences, the stories too painful to pass down. Archaeology reveals graves where Viking-era trauma was literally buried with the victims, skeletons with healed fractures from old raids, their bones outliving the terror etched into them. These weren't just attacks, they were seismic events that fractured time itself, creating a before and after in the collective memory. The Northmen's greatest plunder wasn't gold or slaves. It was the unshakable certainty that safety had always been and would always be an illusion. The Vikings didn't just attack kingdoms, they studied them. Long before axes met flesh, scouts and traders gathered intelligence in bustling market squares, listening for the faintest cracks in a realm's unity. A whispered grievance between rival lords, a simmering succession dispute, even resentment over grain taxes, these weren't trivial gossip to the Northmen. They were invitations. Take England in the 9th century. While Anglo-Saxon rulers like Ethelred and Alfred squabbled over borders, Viking warbands slipped into the chaos like knives through a loose seam. One year, they'd raid Mercia under a tentative truce with Wessex. The next, they'd switch sides, pillaging Wessex with Mercian silver funding their ships. The sagas boast of chieftains who carried 2 sets of alliance tokens, one for each faction, ready to betray either when the price was right. This strategy went beyond mere opportunism. Vikings actively fueled divisions. In Ireland, they armed rival clans to prolong blood feuds, then swept in to claim both weakened sides. Frankish chronicles tell of Northmen posing as envoys, delivering forged letters to stoke paranoia between neighboring counts. Their greatest weapon wasn't the axe, but the understanding that men who hated each other would never unite against a common foe. The brilliance lay in its simplicity. Why waste warriors storming a fortified city when you could bribe its discontented garrison to open the gates? Why fight a united army when a few well-placed rumors could make them suspect their own allies? Viking leaders operated like shadow merchants, trading in distrust and reaping the profits in plunder. Even their infamous Danegeld protection money paid by terrified rulers became a tool of division. Towns that paid found themselves spared only to watch neighbors who couldn't afford the tax burn. The message was clear: solidarity was a luxury, and survival meant looking out for yourself first. By the time kingdoms realized their fatal mistake, the Vikings had already moved on to the next fractured realm, leaving behind a trail of broken treaties and deepened rivalries. Their legacy wasn't just violence, it was the art of turning men's petty hatreds into their own undoing. Dawn breaks over the battlefield, but the enemy won't find orderly lines of shield walls awaiting them, only footprints leading into the forest and the faintest whisper of laughter in the wind. The Vikings didn't believe in fair fights, they believed in winning. While later legends would paint them as noble warriors, the truth was far more pragmatic. If deception could spare a single drop of Northmen's blood, they'd lie, cheat, and vanish into the mist without a second thought. Ambush was their poetry. A Viking warband might let their victims spot them just long enough to provoke a reckless charge straight into a hidden ditch lined with sharpened stakes. Or they'd stage a chaotic retreat, luring overconfident pursuers into a bottleneck where waiting axes could chop them down like overripe wheat. The sagas boast of chieftains who ordered their men to feign drunkenness in enemy camps, only to rise from their stupor at a prearranged signal and slit the throats of their hosts mid-feast. Even truces weren't sacred. A Frankish chronicle recounts how a Viking leader swore peace on a jeweled Christian relic, then spent the night tunneling under the walls his army had just promised not to assault. To the Northmen, oaths weren't chains, they were tools, discarded the moment they outlived their usefulness. Their word was given freely and broken just as easily. What made this ruthlessness so effective was its unpredictability. A village might wake to find their livestock slaughtered and wells poisoned, not by a marauding army, but by 3 silent raiders who'd crept past sentries in wolf pelts. Coastal defenders would brace for a sea assault, only to discover the real attack came from inland, where longships had been hauled over hidden portages weeks earlier. This wasn't cowardice, it was craftsmanship. Viking warriors trained to fight in darkness, to mimic bird calls as signals, to read terrain like a chessboard. Their sagas didn't praise blind bravery, they celebrated the cleverness of a warrior who won without drawing his sword. A famous tale recounts how one chieftain dressed his men in enemy colors, letting them stroll unchallenged into a fortress before unleashing havoc. The lesson was brutal but clear. In the Viking world, survival wasn't about honor, it was about adaptability. While other cultures romanticized single combat and glorious last stands, the Northmen perfected the art of asymmetrical warfare centuries before the term existed. Their legacy wasn't a code of chivalry, but a simple, chilling principle. The only rule of battle was to walk away alive. The village stood eerily intact at first glance, no flames, no bloodstains until you noticed the absence of ordinary sounds. No blacksmith's hammer rang against the anvil, no looms clacked in empty workshops, even the church doors hung crooked, their iron hinges pried away with crowbars. This was the aftermath of Viking efficiency, not just a raid but a wholesale disassembly of civilization itself. Gold and silver were obvious prizes, but the Northmen's true genius lay in recognizing value where others saw only mundanity. A farmer's scythe could be reforged into spearheads. Woolen cloaks became sale patches or barter goods in distant markets. Even wooden spoons and fishing nets were seized, not out of petty greed, but because every ounce of plunder represented one less resource for their enemies to rebuild. Archaeologists find traces of this systematic looting in the smallest details. Norse settlements where everyday objects, Frankish combs, Irish pins, Slavic needles turn up hundreds of miles from their origins, each piece a silent witness to the completeness of Viking theft. What made this so devastating wasn't just the loss of objects, but the destruction of potential. A loom's missing spindle meant no new cloth for winter. Stolen seed grain doomed next year's harvest. Survivors returning to ransacked homes often found the very tools they needed to recover: axes for cutting timber, needles for mending clothes gone, leaving them to gnaw at frozen roots with bare hands. The chronicler Abba of Fleury described villages reduced to gnawing hunger and nakedness, where even the dead were stripped of their burial shrouds before the raiders departed. Yet the most chilling acts were the deliberate leftovers. Vikings sometimes abandoned a single, broken item, a cracked cauldron, a child's wooden toy amid the emptiness. These weren't oversights, they were psychological landmines. That lone surviving possession became a torment, a taunt. We could have taken this too. We chose to let you see it rot. In this way, even the untouched became tainted, a reminder that mercy, when it came, was just another form of cruelty. This was plunder as calculus, a recognition that true dominance required more than battering down gates. It meant ensuring those gates could never be rebuilt. The Vikings didn't just empty treasuries, they dismantled the very machinery of survival, leaving communities not just poor but helpless. When they sailed away, the message lingered in the hollowed-out ruins: wealth wasn't stolen. It had been erased from the ledger altogether. The towering doors of the cathedral burst inward, not from some divine force, but from the brutal kick of a bearded warrior. Inside, the bishop clutched his gilded cross, believing his holy office would shield him. He was wrong. To the Vikings, a man of God wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was a walking treasure chest. High-status captives like bishops and kings weren't collateral damage. They were primary targets, hunted with the same precision as a falcon diving for prey. Gold wasn't the only currency in these raids. Power had its own exchange rate. Imagine the psychological impact when villagers saw their king, once carried on a litter adorned in silk, now stumbling in chains behind a Northman's horse. Or when a congregation watched their bishop, who'd once blessed them with jeweled hands, dragged by his hair onto a longship. The humiliation was calculated. A broken ruler meant a broken people, their faith in authority crumbling faster than the smoldering ruins of their towns. Ransom negotiations were a macabre theater. Viking leaders knew exactly how much a king's pride or a bishop's flock would pay to avoid scandal. Frankish chronicles describe nobles weighed literally by the pound in silver, their value measured like livestock. Some rulers, like the Frankish king Charles the Simple, spent years bargaining for their own freedom while their kingdoms bled dry to fill Viking coffers. Others weren't so lucky. The Irish High King Mael Sechnaill was paraded through Dublin in his undergarments before being executed on a whim, proving even crowns offered no protection. But here's what made this strategy so devastating. It exploited the very hierarchies meant to defend societies. A peasant might hide in the marshes, but a king had to stand his ground or lose legitimacy. A bishop couldn't abandon his flock without damning his soul. The Vikings didn't just ransom the elite, they weaponized their duties against them, turning honor into shackles. And the message echoed far beyond the throne rooms. When a monarch's ransom beggared his kingdom, or when a holy man's capture shook the faith of thousands, the lesson seared itself into every heart. If the mighty could fall so easily, what hope remained for the common man? The Northmen understood something timeless. To conquer a land, you must first unmake its symbols, and nothing shattered the illusion of safety like seeing gods and kings alike dragged into the dirt. The last embers of the burning marketplace hadn't even cooled before the real devastation set in. While swords and fire could erase a town in hours, the economic aftershocks of Viking raids reverberated for lifetimes. This wasn't mere theft, it was systemic strangulation. Every stolen sack of grain, every melted down coin, every sabotaged millstone added up to something far worse than temporary hardship: the slow, irreversible collapse of entire regions. Take Northumbria, once a thriving Anglo-Saxon kingdom. After decades of Viking incursions, its mints fell silent, literally. Archaeologists find coin hoards from the period with coins so worn they're nearly smooth, evidence of a desperate economy recycling the same dwindling silver for generations. Trade routes that had connected the region to Europe for centuries withered as merchants avoided the cursed coasts, leaving markets barren and craftsmen without materials. The Domesday Book, compiled centuries later, still recorded vast swaths of former Viking raid zones as waste, not just damaged but economically hollowed out. But the most insidious damage was invisible. When raiders targeted monasteries, the medieval equivalent of banks and research centers combined, they weren't just burning buildings. They were erasing institutions that had stored grain for famines, trained scribes to keep records, and distributed alms to the poor. A single raid could unravel generations of economic infrastructure, leaving survivors with no way to rebuild. Chroniclers wrote of once fertile valleys where farmers reverted to bartering with nails or eggs because silver had vanished entirely, and of skilled weavers whose children forgot their craft because the tools and teachers were gone. The Vikings played a grim long game. By returning to the same regions year after year, not to conquer but to bleed them slowly, they ensured recovery became impossible. Like a parasite carefully avoiding killing its host, they left just enough to sustain the population. Until the next raid, in Ireland, pollen samples show areas where wheat cultivation abruptly shifted to hardier but less nutritious oats, a silent testament to communities no longer able to invest in quality seed. In Francia, vineyards that had supplied emperors were abandoned as workers fled inland, turning wine regions into scrubland. What made this economic warfare so effective was its compounding nature. Each raid didn't just reset progress, it pushed societies further backward. A village stripped of its blacksmith might rebuild, but without the smith's apprentice killed or enslaved, the knowledge itself died. Trade networks, once severed, rarely reconnected the same way. Even when the raids eventually stopped, the scars remained like a body that survives an infection but never regains its full strength. The true measure of Viking devastation wasn't in the treasures they took, but in the futures they stole. The bloodlines of Europe still whisper secrets of violence centuries later, strands of DNA woven into populations by force, not fate. Modern genetic studies reveal an uncomfortable truth. across Britain, Ireland, and even as far as the Mediterranean, millions carry fragments of Viking ancestry. This wasn't some peaceful mingling of cultures. These genes tell a story of conquest written in the most intimate way possible, through the bodies of those who had no choice. Take the Orkney Islands, where nearly 30% of male lineages trace back to Norse invaders, or Iceland, where early settlers brought so many enslaved Gaelic women that mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child still reflects their stolen heritage today. These aren't just statistics, they're living echoes of individual tragedies. A Scottish woman's genetics might reveal her ancestor was a thrall dragged from her burning village. A Frenchman's Y chromosome could mark the unbroken line of a Viking who forced himself into his family tree. What makes this legacy so chilling is its invisibility. Unlike ruins or sagas, these genetic signatures hide in plain sight. You won't find them carved on runestones or celebrated in epic poems. Just quiet mutations in someone's cheek swab, a biological receipt for horrors their ancestors endured. Historians once assumed Viking settlements were male-dominated outposts, but modern science paints a darker picture, thriving communities built on generations of coerced motherhood. The psychological weight of this inheritance lingers too. Imagine learning your family line exists because some distant foremother survived rape or forced marriage, her trauma encoded in your very cells. Some modern descendants grapple with this duality, their identities torn between pride in Viking heritage and sorrow for what their ancestors suffered or inflicted. Yet there's a cruel irony here. The same violence that scarred communities also created unexpected resilience. Geneticists note that some populations subjected to Viking raids show heightened immune adaptations, biological armor forged in the crucible of invasion. The past can't be undone, but neither can its quiet, stubborn imprint on the present. Every time someone traces their roots to a long-ago raid, they're confronting a truth as old as history itself. Conquest isn't just about land or gold. It's about whose blood gets to remember. The silver screen loves a rugged antihero, axe in hand, wind in his hair, a hint of tragic nobility beneath the blood-stained furs. But peel back the Hollywood gloss and you're left with a truth that chills the bones. The real Vikings didn't just inspire dark legends, they outdid them. Consider this, while modern retellings focus on charming rogues like Ragnar Lothbrok, actual Norse sagas recount warriors who used infants for archery practice, who strung up priests like grotesque wind chimes to serenade their feasts. Even the most graphic fantasy novels shy away from the reality of Viking slave markets where children were priced by weight like livestock, their futures measured in ounces of silver. Chroniclers like Alcuin of York wrote of attacks so savage they seemed not the work of men but of demons unleashed, their brutality surpassing anything mere storytellers dared invent. The gap between myth and reality isn't just about scale, it's about intent. Pop culture Vikings fight for honor or adventure. Historical raiders orchestrated suffering with the precision of a blacksmith tempering steel. Take the siege of Nantes in 843. Witnesses described Northmen herding townsfolk into a church before setting it ablaze, not to send a message, but to test how long screams could last before the roof collapsed. This wasn't chaos, it was cruelty honed to a science, yet perhaps the most jarring contrast lies in legacy. Modern narratives frame Vikings as complex figures, explorers, traders, even proto-democrats. But dig through the archaeology, and you'll find mass graves where skeletons clutch shattered crucifixes, their bones bearing the marks of systematic torture. Iceland's democratic assemblies, they were funded by silver torn from monasteries where every monk had his hands severed. Even their famed navigational skills served a grim purpose, to pinpoint the softest targets, the most defenseless communities. The uncomfortable truth is this: the Vikings weren't misunderstood antiheroes. They were pioneers of psychological warfare, masters of trauma economics, architects of a terror so potent it reshaped continents. No saga, no matter how dark, could capture the full scope of their violence because imagination has limits. History doesn't. What remains isn't just the ruins they left behind, but the echoes of a simple, devastating lesson. Sometimes the worst monsters aren't the ones we invent. They're the ones who walked among us. The Viking Age wasn't just a chapter of history, it was a raw, unflinching testament to the extremes of human brutality. Behind the romanticized tales of explorers and warriors lies a far darker truth. A world where entire villages vanished overnight, where faith was trampled underfoot, and where survival was a privilege measured in screams. These 25 realities haven't just shattered myths, they've exposed a chilling blueprint for terror, one that reshaped continents and left scars still felt today. But why does this matter now? Because history isn't just about dates and artifacts, it's about understanding the weight of human choices. The Vikings didn't just leave behind burned monasteries and mass graves. They forced societies to reckon with a simple, ugly question. How far would you go to survive when mercy wasn't an option? Their legacy isn't just in the silver they stole, but in the shadows they cast over generations, shadows that taught us how quickly civilization can unravel when fear takes the throne. Yet there's a strange duality here. For all their savagery, the Vikings were also architects of the world we know, traders, navigators, even lawmakers in their own right. But that doesn't soften the horror. If anything, it sharpens it. How do we reconcile the blood on their hands with the roads they built? The answer isn't simple because history never is. So as we close this journey into the fury of the Northmen, let's not look away from the darkness. Let's honor the victims by remembering their stories, not just the legends of their conquerors. And if this glimpse into the past has left you unsettled, good. That means you're paying attention. Now it's your turn. What shocked you the most? The psychological warfare, the sheer scale of suffering, or the way these raids still echo in our DNA today? Drop your thoughts below, and if you're ready to dive deeper into history's untold horrors, hit subscribe. The past has plenty more secrets to reveal, and they're not for the